Welcome to PolarisLive. This is Sarwar Kashmiri welcoming our viewers from around the world to the series of programs on the United States and China in the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. I'd like to remind our viewers that you can ask questions throughout this program using the comment button on the right-hand side of the screen. Time permitting, we'll get to as many of them as we can. My guest today is Dr. Parag Khanna. He's a leading global strategy advisor, world traveler, best-selling author. He's founder and CEO of Climate Alpha, an artificial intelligence-powered analytics platform to forecast asset values and future-proof global real estate. He's also founder and managing partner of Future Map, real data scenario-based strategic advisory firm. A widely cited global intellectual, appears frequently in media around the world, such as CNN, BBC, CNBC, Al Jazeera, and many other broadcasters. I should say he's traveled to over 150 countries. Parag's latest book is Move: Where People Are Going for a Better Future 2021. One of its key messages is we're going to have mass migration on a scale that has never been seen before. With which provocative statement, let me welcome Dr. Parag Khanna. How are you, Dr. Khanna?
So lovely to see you, Sarwar. How's it going?
It's going very well. You always have an enviable background to you, maps and terrestrial things, and many of which you've invented yourself. So I look forward always to having you on.
Likewise. So great to see you again.
Now, listen, I want to talk about the main message in your book, right? Which is we are going to have mass migrations on a scale that has never been seen before. But let me start by pointing out to you that in 1980, that conservative of most conservative American presidents, Republican presidents, during his nomination for the presidency, he extolled immigrants in America by saying, "Make the immigrants, make America great again." That phrase, of course, has now been co-opted by all the anti-immigrant folks in America, and that anti-immigrant tide now flows around the world. So how does this square with your message, Parag, that the world is going to see migrations on a scale that it has never seen before?
Great. That is the right place to begin. It's the biggest question of all, and therefore we shouldn't answer it starting with polemics, Democrat, Republican, American, or foreign. We should just start with the facts. We are a nomadic species. We have been for 100,000 years. It's only in the last several centuries that populations have become more or less, rooted and settled, industrial, sedentary, urban, and so forth. And that's also not everywhere. It's in those locations where we're fortunate enough to be politically and climatically stable. But mass migration has also been a feature of our human life and society for the past several centuries. We've literally had an increase from, say, millions to tens of millions to hundreds of millions over the course of the past centuries. In fact, in each century, really, the number of people who migrate internationally, the decimal point keeps moving to the right. And therefore, it's not outlandish at all to suggest that in this century, the 21st century, the decimal place will shift further, and upwards of 1 billion people may either voluntarily or involuntarily relocate. We're 20 years into this century, and we're already off to a pretty enormous start in that direction, almost undeniable at this point. Not only are the historical factors that push people to relocate, whether it is political violence and upheaval, international conflicts, whether it is the search for a better life, economic migration, whether it's demographic imbalances as countries seek to bridge labor shortages, or, of course, climate change. It's actually all of those things at the same time right now. And so I fully expect that in addition to the hundreds of millions of people who are already classified as international migrants, there will be hundreds of millions more. And again, seen in a historical standpoint, this is hardly a difficult claim at all to make. It's actually very much in the trend line, with all of the drivers of migration really operating in overdrive. So I find it very difficult to find evidence to suggest that would actually refute this claim.
Let me then ask you that immigration into America, together with this more or less anti-immigration message that is being put out, right? There is also this issue of some people say now some bias, against Asians, some violence against Asians. There are fewer people. America used to be, as you know well, Parag, a magnet for Chinese students, which helped fund a lot of the American universities and research with their tuition and fees. More of them now, seem to not come here. The same thing is happening in India. There are more Indians that seem to be headed elsewhere than America. So is there an imbalance, you think, in what you are projecting to Western countries? Is the migration patterns going to change any?
We will have a continuation of pre-existing migration patterns, and we will also have new patterns. Let's remember that since the 1965 Immigration Act, Asian immigration into the United States has expanded very, very significantly, far beyond anyone's imagination from the 1960s. The majority of new citizens annually, or the largest share of new citizens annually in the United States, are Asians, actually even exceeding the number of Latinos. Canada, to round out the North American picture, is bringing in 400,000 new migrants every single year. Many of them are also Asian. We're seeing growing Asian populations in Europe. In fact, one of the concepts that I deploy in this book is Asian Europeans. Now, I use that almost sort of tongue-in-cheek because I grew up as an Asian American. We don't use the term Asian European because we don't think there are any. But in fact, there are. There are about 4 million Asian Europeans, and that's just in the European Union. I'm excluding Britain, which is not in the EU anymore, and which, of course, has, due to the colonial experience and post-colonial migrations, a large number of particularly South Asians. So I predict that that number, 4 million, will easily grow to 20, 30 million or more Asian Europeans in the coming decades. And therefore, there will actually be more Asians in Europe than even in North America. So that's an example of a massive new vector of migration coming out of Asia. Why are we emphasizing Asia? Well, not only because you rightly pointed out the large number of Asians who have historically come to the United States and North America, but also because, of course, Asia represents the largest share of the global population. Over 50% of the human population is Asian. And more significantly still, the majority of young people, those who are most likely and have the highest propensity to migrate, are also Asian, and in particular, South Asian. This year, India's population will equal that of China's. It effectively already has, of course. And the total population of just South Asia's largest countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, amounts to 1.8 plus billion people, with a higher propensity to migrate outward than Chinese have, who are in any case older demographically. So there's no question that we will see much larger South Asian diasporas around the world. North America, Europe, the former Soviet republics is another vector that I talk about in the book. In fact, I think you might find this entertaining, given both of our heritage. I talk about the reverse Mughal Empire. In the 16th century, the Mughal Empire descended from Central Asia to conquer the Delhi, to conquer basically the northern territories in particular of the Indian subcontinent. And now what I foresee is a reverse Mughal Empire of South Asians moving north into the steppe lands of Central Asia and the various other countries of the former Soviet Union.
That is so interesting. I can just see the millions of spinning wheels, spinning cotton throughout Central Asia going forward. But hey, listen, that, by the way, is a really, really wonderful analogy, description that you've just done. But let me throw a little bit of a wrinkle into this, right? Fertility rates have been dropping since the 60s. China and India, could shrink. They say China could, the population might become 500 million, India a little more. How does this factor into what your thesis is?
Very, very strongly. In fact, in this book, I coined the phrase peak humanity, which is to say the world population will reach a plateau of probably under 10 billion people much sooner than we expected. And that has a lot to do with the trends that were in any case bending global fertility since the 1970s. Contraception, family planning, female empowerment, education, urbanization, and many other things. And now you also have the baby busts of the financial crisis and COVID. And the COVID baby bust is far more severe than the financial crisis one was. All of those factors compounded have led to a massive decline in fertility. Of course, China's one-child policy being part of that as well. So taken together, the world, if we were having this conversation 15, 20 years ago, as you know, people had forecasted a world population reaching 15 billion people and a Malthusian crisis and so forth. Instead, I don't think the world population will even reach 10 billion. So most of the people who will ever live at the same time are actually alive today. Generation Alpha, which is today's toddlers, will actually wind up being smaller than Generation Z. And so we are reaching that peak humanity, but that doesn't mean that migration will stop. It actually, is a reminder of the very significant labor shortages our countries, have experienced and will continue to experience, given life expectancy and longevity. So aging populations in need of young people to be the taxpayers and caregivers and construction workers and homeowners and entrepreneurs and so forth, which they're already lacking, let alone in the future. So I imagine, in fact, that one of the other operating principles in this book, besides peak humanity, is what I call the global war for young talent. And there's two kinds of countries out there, Sarva. There are those that realize that they are in a global war for young talent and are changing their immigration policies to compete vigorously in that war. And there are those countries that do not realize it and are losing people and will lose that war and will demographically slide into oblivion.
Well, let me, I want to push a little bit into this argument of peak humanity that you've made. It's a wonderful phrase. But here's where I'm coming from, Parag. I remember a number of years ago, there was a very well-researched, state-of-the-art report that basically said that the world is going to peak. Everything is going to peak. We're going to run out of food. And they ran this through the group was called, the report was called, I believe, the Rome Group.
The Hub of Rome, that's right.
Yes, and they ran it to the then big, massive IBM computers. They said they've done all the different modeling, and everything peaks out at such and such a time. And of course, it didn't. Then we had peak oil, which we were going to run out, or I forget exactly what. But there again, the idea was that it would be peak oil. We'd run out of energy, but then along came fracking and all of that. How accurate do you think the projections are that you quote?
Well, that's exactly my point. They were wrong massively. So in the same way we were wrong about peak oil supply, it turns out we were wrong about, both supply and demand, in the sense that demand will decrease as solar and other renewable energy sources get deployed. And supply has not peaked because we have not only new discoveries of oil, but also gas. But on the subject of your question, it's precisely the forecasts that the population would grow in a runaway fashion, such as that forecast that the Club of Rome warned about, that actually gave rise to and inspired many of the countermeasures that I mentioned earlier around promoting family planning and fertility control and so forth. That is the reason that the world population has come down so significantly. We were right about the warnings, which is why we were wrong about the forecast, because we overreacted in a good way to those warnings. And that's actually one of the seminal examples of foresight, because indeed it was a work of interdisciplinary research. And it so profound was its impact that we actually wound up taking the steps to prevent that worst case scenario. And therefore, here we are, a world population that will not reach 15 billion people, because we warned that that would be so bad. And we listened to the warnings, and now we will not even reach 10 billion. Now, 10 billion is still a lot of people in a world that's climate stressed, and some parts of the world still have or do have obviously overpopulation challenges, such as, of course, South Asia, for example. And the resource stress overlaps with the geography of overpopulation. Hence our point earlier about South Asian populations migrating outward, not least because of climate change, but already because of the search for economic opportunity, education, liberal culture, political freedom, all of these kinds of things. So, you know, what you have is a world where there's this massive imbalance between the geography of climate resilient areas and the number of people and the age of people in those areas versus the overwhelming number of young people in the world who are concentrated in resource-stressed and politically volatile areas, who would be much better off in their own lives and in the service of the world economy and society if they were in other locations. Now, does everyone want to just pick up and leave their home, the only place they've known where their family lives and resides? Of course not. But that doesn't mean that they feel that they should be stuck in place forever. And I say, if you leave it up to them, we have survey after survey after survey after survey of young people across Latin America, Africa, the Arab world, and South Asia. Again, the largest, most populous, young regions of the planet. And Sarah, you know where I'm going with this. You know exactly what those surveys say. They want out. They would love to leave. So the very notion that informs your and my, people of our generation's thinking about what constitutes identity, and the default assumption that we are first and foremost loyal to our country of origin and birth and citizenship is literally a false statement as it applies to an overwhelming percentage of the world's young population who are quite opportunistic. If given the chance, they would relocate. And as it turns out, the societies to which they would go would probably benefit significantly economically if they would make efforts to assimilate those people. And that's exactly what I advocate.
You know, you just remind me of that famous verse from that Indian poet Iqbal, right? Remember, he said, "Hindi hai hum, watan hai sara jahan hamara." That we may be Indians, but the world is our home, right?
That's right.
Which brings me to my next question to you, which is, people don't go to China. It's a very homogeneous society. They don't go to Japan. I mean, India has some, but not that many. So is buried in your projection the idea that the places which need more people to populate them are not going to get them, that they will all go to where the money is? I mean, a large part of the world seems to be locked out from immigration because of their homogeneous populations.
Well, China is a special case because it has 1.5 billion people. It still has a very large population. The fact that it has reached the peak of nearing the peak of its population, and certainly has peaked in terms of its working age population, and that it has a high dependency ratio, has not therefore convinced China that it simply, because of the law of numbers, needs to import a large numbers of people. Now, China does try to import caregivers, nurses from the Philippines and other demographics as it needs them. But it's not going to be a high mass immigration society for cultural, political, and other reasons. It's also seeking to use robotics and automation to compensate for the shrinking workforce. And where it seeks talent, of course, it will try to import highly skilled individuals who will work in its industry. That's obviously something that's very contentious right now with the kind of the tech sector clash with the United States. But that's, again, not representative, because remember that even though China is aging, it still has 700 million people below its median age. So China does have more young people than all of Europe has people. Let's not forget that. Sometimes we talk about China as if everyone is, walking with a cane, and that's really not true. When you have 1.5 billion people, we have to remember that. So let's treat China as sui generis, because it is. That said, at times when it does not restrict the issuance of passports, there can be a significant outflow of Chinese, and that has for decades now reshaped economies, property markets, and so forth, and from Canada to Singapore to Australia and elsewhere in the world. So let's not count out the out-migration of Chinese as well. Now, one thing we have to be clear about is this notion of, this default notion of immigration restrictions and so forth. So we alluded to this earlier, but we need to cover more countries. It is not true that xenophobic, racist, anti-immigrant, populist sentiment rules the world. That is matter-of-factly false. The high immigration societies of the 20th century, the most desirable destinations for migrants all over the planet, Canada, United States, England, Germany, Australia, Japan, precisely those countries are more open today than they've been in a long time. In America, in a reversal from the Trump administration, actually over the last 8 years, including even the late Obama years, immigration began to decline to a floor of about 225,000 people last year. This year, net inward immigration to the United States is predicted to be over 800,000 people. So I don't see Trump's immigration policy ruling America at the moment. It's simply not. Canada has been very consistent. Again, 400,000 people every year, actually more than 400,000, because it's as the population grows, they pledge to maintain a 1% growth rate in the population. Then you have Germany. 2022 in Germany has already surpassed 2016 in Germany in terms of net inward immigration. Britain has reversed course massively. It's easier to migrate to the United Kingdom right now as we speak than at any time since, or even before Brexit. Such is the state of their labor shortages and their need for everyone from farmers to nurses to truck drivers to entrepreneurs and college graduates in general. And on it goes. There have never been as many foreigners living in Japan as there are today. So the places that people want to go, Sarva, are very, very open. And those are just the big countries. So let's be clear that just because Viktor Orban shows up in our Twitter feed, it does not mean that he's representative of global immigration policy. He is an absolute, peripheral figure, and the important countries are doing the right thing.
Sorry, I interrupted you there, but I wanted to ask you, you've always been very high on Canada as a forward-looking, industrialized country. Can you summarize why?
Well, I mean, it's not. I don't have any particular, connection to Canada. Canada comes up in my research subjects in a wide range of ways. I obviously, as a student of geography, can't ignore what is effectively the largest well-functioning country in the world. I can't, include Russia in that category, and obviously, it's a particular interest given that they view immigration policy as fundamental to their economic policy. They believe that collecting people is collecting power. And that's actually an old 19th century geopolitical formula. And I'm glad to see Canada pursuing it. And in any case, as it does so, it does wind up in a way contributing to the overall strength of North America. It's obviously also a climate resilient country relative to most others in the world. And therefore, for both reasons, climate resilience and high immigration, it comes up very prominently in this book, since those are two of the key subjects that I deal with.
We are, here 15th in November. Humanity is going to add its 8 billionth member. Dr. Khanna, have been widely questioned by governments, corporations, to advise them on growth in the future, risk trajectories. So on this auspicious day, I'd love to ask you that if you could project a message from the UN about this 8th billionth human being, what might you tell the world? And then, if you don't mind, take America and China, just some words of advice to both of them.
That's a great question. I've been thinking a lot about that. As the world population reaches 8 billion, who is that median human being in the world? And who that person is turns a lot of our conventional wisdom and discourse and assumptions on its head. Because when we, meaning you or I, tend to speak about the world, maybe not specifically you and me, but let's say the Western, society and audiences with whom we frequently converse, there's a sense that we speak for the world, and we is Western, educated, middle class, 2-income, husband, wife, married household with 2 children, living in a suburban community in North America or Europe. Well, that's not that median person, though, right? I mean, of the 8 billion people in the world, the median person is young, not old. Person is not married, single. Person is not living in a Western country. Is definitely living in a developing country, in a developing world megacity. Probably is not a property owner, is a renter, is financially struggling, has no children. Right? That's like the median person in the world. That's who the future is, by and large, or people who you would describe in that way. So when we talk about the future, the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, that's increasingly who we need to think about, or we should already be thinking about as the people who populate our world. And therefore, we have to think about what are the political, economic, social systems that are most appropriate for that type of population, and what are their priorities. And their priorities, again, are very clear. We survey young people endlessly everywhere. And what's fascinating is that irrespective of their country of origin, whether they're North American, Western in general, Asian, African, Latin American, we find that young people gravitate towards certain principles. They articulate support for certain rights, which include in particular the right to connectivity, meaning, of course, digital connectivity, right to mobility, believing that mobility is a human right, and sustainability. Right, a sustainable ecosystem. So mobility, connectivity, sustainability. And we have to ask ourselves, are our political and economic and social systems designed to cater to and support and optimize for a world population that believes in these principles? And the answer, of course, is not even close, not yet.
Well, we only have about 2 minutes left here, Parag. And I wanted to, obviously, this program tries to bring voices into both US and China. I do want to ask you just a line or two advice for US and advice for China.
Well, I mentioned earlier, the US is fortunately going back to this view that collecting people is collecting power. And I hope it does so in a steady, predictable way, just in terms of the demographics and in a continuation of what that has already meant for America in terms of economic output, productivity, innovation, and obviously cultural diversity and dynamism, right? The America is, bar none, the biggest winner in history from this global war for talent that has transpired, particularly over the last 150, 200 years. China, my point to China, just separate from the demographic circumstances that we discussed earlier, has much more to do with its position within Asia. Because what China needs to appreciate, whether it's the fact that it's come out of this recent party congress, or with respect to geopolitical tensions with the United States, and obviously with its neighbors in Asia, is that Asia is historically a multipolar region. It's rich in civilizational diversity, and that Asia is a multipolar region in a multipolar world. And China is very important. China is a superpower, but China is ultimately one anchor, one pole of power in the Asian and in the global systems. And it cannot, should not, and will not actually dominate all of Asia, and therefore will not dominate the world. And that's a lesson both to Chinese and Americans, to appreciate that the era we're moving into is again multipolar, multi-civilizational, still remains interconnected and globalized, despite all the talk of decoupling and so forth. So I think we need a understanding of that baseline kind of condition. And I don't think that even that simple structural fact has been properly internalized either in Washington or Beijing. So even though that goes back one or two books that you and I have already talked about that subject from a previous book of mine, we still have to keep driving that point home, you and I both.
Well, Dr. Parakhanna, thank you so much for appearing on PolarisLive again. Listening to you for a half hour is like a PhD education. Thank you for taking the time. I know how busy you are. Really appreciate your presence here.
Always such a pleasure. Great to see you again.
Thank you to our viewers from around the world. Please join us again for the next episode of PolarisLive, US and China and the world. Until then, goodbye.